Good afternoon, and welcome to the Armstrong Browning Library's annual Browning Day Lecture. I'm Jennifer Borderud, Assistant Dean for Special Libraries and Director of the Armstrong Browning Library, and I'm grateful to you all for joining us on this beautiful Friday afternoon. Browning Day provides us with the opportunity to learn from the scholars from around the world who hold visiting research fellowships with us each year. You will meet and hear from one of those scholars, Professor Joseph Phelan, in just a moment. But I also want to recognize two other visiting scholars who are with us right now. Dr. Justin Gilbert, if you want to just wave over here, from De Montfort University in the UK, and Dr. Paul Carey, if you wouldn't mind, from BYU. So I hope that you will say hello to Dr. Gilbert and Dr. Carey after today's lecture and talk with them about the research that they are doing while they're here with us. We're really pleased to have you both with us. I would now like to invite Dr. Kristen Pond, Associate Professor of English and Margaret Root Brown Chair in Robert Browning and Victorian Studies, to introduce our speaker. Following the talk, Curator Laura French will moderate the Q&A, and Curator Joanna Lamb will close our program. Dr. Pond.
Thank you all so much for being here on such a beautiful afternoon. I do love it, though, when the sun is streaming through the windows. It makes it really nice. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker to you all today. Joseph Phelan is Professor of 19th Century Literature at De Montfort University in Leicester, England. He was educated at King's College, Cambridge, and King's College, London. He is the author of two monographs on 19th century poetry, the 19th Century Sonnet, and the Music of Verse, Metrical Experiment in 19th Century Poetry. He's also co-editor, along with John Wolford and Daniel Carlin, of the Longman Annotated English Poets Edition of the Poems of Robert Browning, volumes 5 and 6, which were published in 2022, and he's currently working on volume 7 of the Longman edition, which you'll hear more about today. And he's also working on a monograph on the poetry of author Hugh Clow, which will be published by Liverpool University in 2027. Professor Phelan has become a familiar face here at the ABL. I believe this is his third or fourth visit. He's told me how important the Visiting Scholars Program has been to him and his project on Robert Browning. It's the kind of relationship that the ABL loves to foster between scholars and their projects. We're so glad to partner with you on this project, Joe, and grateful for all the work you are doing to make Robert Browning's poems accessible and available to a wider audience. Thank you for sharing with us today more about your work.
Well, thank you very much, Kristen, for that very kind introduction. What I'm going to talk about today, as Kristen suggested, is the next volume of the Longman Poems of Robert Browning, volume 7. And there are 3 poems in this volume, 3 very lengthy poems. This is kind of the unfashionable end of Robert Browning we're getting to now towards the end of his career. The 3 poems in question are Phelan at the Fair, Red Cotton Nightcap Country, and Aristophanes' Apology. And the poem I'll be focusing on mostly today is Red Cotton Nightcap Country, or, to give it its full title, Red Cotton Nightcap Country, or Turf and Towers. Okay? That's been the main focus of my work while I've been over here for the last couple of weeks, along with my co-editor, Justin Gilbert. Okay. Now, the poem, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, and I won't be assuming too much familiarity with the poem today, the poem is like a kind of miniature version of The Ring and the Book, if anything that's over 4,000 lines long can be described as miniature. Okay. It's like the earlier poem, it's based on a real-life story of a rather gruesome and unpleasant kind, and relies for much of its information on the records of a court case. What I want to do today is to talk a little bit about some of the challenges of editing a poem based on documentary sources of this kind, and to suggest some of the reasons for Browning's interest in the Victorian equivalent of the true crime podcast. I'll also be telling the strange story of how Browning almost faced the prospect of getting caught up in the events he was describing and the impact this had on the poem. Before doing all this, though, I think it would be helpful to provide a brief summary of the story on which the poem is based. Okay. So I'll just spend the next couple of minutes just outlining the story, because it's a fairly lengthy poem and it does tell quite an interesting and sensational story in some respects. So it deals with the life and untimely death, early death, of a man called Antonio Malerio, who was the heir to a Parisian jewelry fortune. Okay. His family was of Italian origin, but had been based in Paris since the 17th century. And the family jewelry business, Malerio Brothers, still exists, in fact, today in Paris, in the Rue de la Paix, if you want to go and visit. It has a good claim to be the oldest continuous family-run business in Europe. Okay, so it's quite amazing. Now, as a young man, Antonio lived what the poem describes as a dissolute life, enjoying the pleasures of Paris in the 1850s. Then, one day in 1853, during a visit to the theatre, he saw a young woman who called herself Anna de Beaupré and fell madly in love with her. Unfortunately for Antonio, Anna was not who she seemed. She was a married woman called Madame de Baca and the mistress of another wealthy man. Even after finding out these unpleasant truths, however, he determined to stay with her, and they lived together in a kind of marital relationship. Okay. Now, when Antonio's father died, he inherited a share of the family business and a large country estate in Normandy, which he spent a lot of money improving. When Antonio's mother died, a few years later, things began to unravel. She'd been a very devout Catholic and had never really approved of his relationship with Madame de Baca. And when Antonio rushed to Paris on hearing of her illness, only to find that she'd already died, he was informed by the priest at her bedside that she'd expressed profound unhappiness with her son's lifestyle just before her death. Now, this seems to have driven Antonio into some kind of a breakdown, and this is where the story starts to get a little bit unpleasant, unfortunately. So brace yourselves. In a fit of remorse for his conduct, he picked up a box containing letters he'd received from Madame de Baca and held it over a fire, an open fire, shouting, "Burn, burn, purify my past." Okay? And this resulted in severe and irreversible injuries to his hands, so much so that he had to learn how to write with his mouth afterwards. It was really life-changing injuries. Notwithstanding this, he returned to his country estate with Madame de Baca to begin a new and more devout life, making charitable donations to the nearby church of Notre-Dame de la Délivrance, which plays a significant role in the story, and which I'll say a little bit more about shortly, and carrying out expensive renovations to his house. The profound instability induced by his mother's death had not, however, gone away. And in April 1870, he either jumped or fell inadvertently to his death from a kind of observation tower at the top of his house. So it's not clear if he committed suicide or if it was an accident. In his will, he left all of his property to the convent at La Délivrance, with a life interest and a substantial sum to Madame de Baca. This will was immediately contested by the other members of the Malerio family, and the resulting court case, which took place in the summer of 1872, was the source of Browning's information for the poem. The cousinry, as Browning disparagingly calls the other members of the Malerio family, claimed that Antonio had not been of sound mind when he made the will and sought to have it set aside so that they could get the money, of course. The judge, however, ruled in favour of the convent and of Madame de Baca. So that's the story, essentially. Okay. Now, all of this takes place against the backdrop of the imminent Franco-Prussian War of 1870, which resulted in a catastrophic defeat for France and a period of political violence and instability reminiscent of the French Revolution of 1789. I'll say a tiny bit more about that later on. France, the Second Empire in France, collapsed. There was catastrophic defeat, and out of the ruins of that, there was a short-lived episode called the Paris Commune, which some of you might have heard of, in which there was a great deal of violence and bloodshed. So it reminded a lot of people of the events of 1789, of the First French Revolution. Now, there's no doubt that Browning sees in Malerio's fate a kind of premonition of the downfall of France. Like the country itself, Malerio is torn between a fervent, unreconstructed version of Catholicism, which expresses itself in traditional acts of ritual devotion, and what was regarded in England at the time as a typically French inability to resist the pleasures of the flesh. One of the leitmotifs of the poem concerns the crowning of the statue of the Virgin Mary at Notre-Dame de la Délivrande, towards which Malerio is said to have contributed a costly diamond and which functions as a kind of symbol of this Catholic piety. Now we find out if the clicker works. There we are, it does. Okay. So this is the statue of Notre-Dame de la Délivrande, which is still there, of course, at the cathedral there in northern France, in a town called Douvres-la-Délivrande. There's the statue. The crowning of that statue is part of a kind of whole series of crownings of statues of the Virgin Mary that were paid for or subsidized by the Pope during the latter part of the 19th century. It was a little bit of a craze. Okay. And the Valerio family contributed allegedly the chief jewel in both of the crowns. Okay. And there's the lines in the poem referring to this. And so was based on mother-in-law Baylor, the pair of crowns, the mothers you must see. Miranda, the great Paris goldsmith, made the marble. He's a neighbour. That's his path before you. Treetop wall to wall. His shop it was turned out a masterpiece, probably at his own expenditure. Anyhow, his was the munificence contributed to the central and supreme splendour that crowns the crown itself, the sun. So you'll notice here, sorry for walking away from the mic there, you'll notice here that the donor of the jewel is called Miranda in the poem and not Malerio, okay? And the reason for that is that Browning changed all of the names of the characters in the story for reasons that I'll come back to later on, okay? So when you're reading the poem, you don't read directly about the people whose names I've mentioned before. They all have pseudonyms, they all have alternative names, okay? This political context also helps to explain both the title and the subtitle of the poem. The title, Red Cotton Nightcap Country, represents a rather laboured allusion to the sleepiness of the region of Normandy in which these events take place, symbolised by the white caps worn by the inhabitants, combined with a reference to the bonnet rouge or Phrygian cap of liberty adopted by the French revolutionaries and revived by the Paris Communards in 1871. So it's a kind of as I said, a fairly laboured symbol. On the one hand, on the one side of the slide there, you can see a rather extravagant version of the traditional white cap that was worn by lots of people in the region. And then on the other side, you can see the red cap of liberty that the French revolutionaries wore. And the poem kind of suggests that beneath the white cap of the sleepiness of Normandy, there is in fact a kind of bubbling undercurrent of revolutionary violence. Okay. The turf and towers of the subtitle similarly refers to another of the poem's recurring images. The turf is the life of sensual pleasure to which Malerio is drawn, and the towers are the ideal of religious devotion and austerity, which compromises and undermines his ability to enjoy these pleasures. Now, Browning first heard this story while holidaying in a place called Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer in Normandy, very close to the country estate where Malerio lived, along with his sister Sariana, his friend Joseph Misson, and Anne Thackeray Ritchie, the daughter of the novelist William Makepeace Thackeray, and the person to whom the poem is dedicated. In an act of gallantry, Browning presents his own poem as a kind of preface to the greater and better work that Anne Thackeray, a novelist like her father, will write about her experiences in Normandy. And the opening section of the poem takes the form of a kind of extended conversation between the two as they walk along the coastline of Saint-Aubin, just a week after the festival to celebrate the crowning of the statue of the Virgin Mary at La Délivrande. Okay. Now, I think it's fair to say that only Robert Browning could have thought of turning this sordid catalogue of human vice, greed, and misery into a poem. As his friend Thomas Carlyle put it, nobody out of Bedlam ever before thought of choosing such a theme. As he did with The Ring and the Book, Browning set about gathering evidence, procuring newspaper accounts, talking to local people, and researching the history of the area and of the church of Notre-Dame de la Délivrande. And some sections of the poem, in fact, are very closely modelled on Browning's sources. So there was a little booklet issued about the crowning of the statue, and there are whole stretches of the poem which are really simply versifications of what's in that source material, obviously translated from French and then versified. Some of these sources are relatively easy to recover, but it's not always possible to be certain where Browning got his information from. And the following passage will illustrate some of the issues. Okay, so I'm challenging your eyesight a little bit here, I'm sure, but I'll read through some of the important bits. Okay, so this is the part of the poem when, the kind of climax of the poem really, when Malerio leaps from the balustrade. And although it's not tremendously clear, there is in fact in the background there a picture of the Château de Tréville where Malerio lived. And if you can see it on the slide, there is also the belvedere at the top of the house where he leapt from or fell from. Okay, so the poem goes, a sublime spring from the balustrade about the tower so often talked about, a flash in middle-air, and stone dead lay Monsieur Léonce Miranda on the turf. That's the pseudonym for Malerio. A gardener who watched at work the while, dibbling a flower bed for geranium shoots, saw the catastrophe, and straightening back, stood up and shook his brows. Poor soul, just what I prophesied the end would be. Ah, the red nightcap, as he raised the head. This must be what he meant by those strange words while I was weeding larkspurs yesterday. Angels would take him. Mad. Okay. Notice the recurrence here of the red cotton nightcap motif. This incident took place relatively early in the morning, before Malerio Miranda had had time to get dressed, so he still imagined wearing his nightcap, and of course, now that he's fallen to his death, it's blood-stained. This climactic moment in the poem is based on evidence from the court case. The fact that the gardener at the chateau, one Alfred Richer, was the first person to discover the body was mentioned in the proceedings. And indeed, Richer himself wrote to a local newspaper called Le Bonhomme Normand, shortly after the event itself, to contradict its suggestion that Malerio's death had been a suicide prompted, in part, by his guilt and remorse about his relationship with Madame de Backer. So I'm not expecting, I mean, there's just an extract there from that newspaper, Le Bonhomme Normand, written by the gardener himself, Mr. Richer. So you can see there that this is based very much on real-life events. This actually happened, and this guy was the first one to see Malerio after his death. Okay. But Browning's version of events in the poem is actually quite a lot closer to the account given by the gardener, by Richer, to the police during their investigation of the incident. Richer, the gardener, attested that at 10 a.m., while working in the park about 60 meters from the chateau, he heard a thud and then saw in the garden walk the body of Malerio, whose skull was cracked. He thought Malerio probably fell accidentally. The witness added that for some time Malerio had been a little disturbed in his head and had been subject to fits of mental derangement. Okay. There are, of course, a few differences between this account and that of the poem. Browning makes the gardener an eyewitness, presumably for greater dramatic effect. But the overall trajectory of events is very similar. And that's a report from the newspaper, the Journal de Caen, from the 24th of July, 1873, which includes the words I've just read out, but obviously in the original French. The problem, though, is that this police report doesn't appear to have been published until after the appearance of Browning's poem. So the poem came out in May 1873, but we don't see these words in print until July 1873, so clearly they can't have been the source of what's in the poem. Okay. They were reported in 1873 because there was an appeal. The Malerio family appealed against the verdict. They lost again, incidentally. And when this appeal was heard in July 1873, it was extensively reported in local newspapers. So there's the first appearance of the gardener's statement, but it's after the poem. So as I said, it can't be the source of what's in the poem. Now, the picture on the slide there, which I took myself last week, is in fact from Browning's own copy of the Journal de Caen, which is here at the ABL, and I think probably nowhere else in the world. Because the online archive of the Journal de Caen is missing this day's edition, for some reason. I don't know why. It's been misfiled, misplaced. But anyway, the slightly tatty copy we have here at the ABL is the only one left. So it's great that we're still able to access it here. And it's a reminder of the importance of keeping paper documents as well as digital ones. Okay. This is, moreover, not the only moment in the poem when Browning seems to have had access to material that was not yet in the public domain. His summary of the verdict, for instance, seems to be based on a reading of the actual judgment rather than the very brief accounts contained in the newspapers. He later claimed that his friend Joseph Milson had helped him investigate the circumstances of Malerio's death, and it's possible that Milson's influence in the area might have enabled him to procure documents that were not available to the general public at the time of the poem's publication. Okay. The search for the sources of a poem based on a real-life incident is not just an exercise in intellectual curiosity, though this is, of course, part of the attraction. The real value of this exercise is that it helps us to understand the ways in which Browning transformed the factual material behind the poem into the shape he wanted it to assume. In talking about both The Ring and the Book and Red Cotton Nightcap Country, Browning was keen to insist that he'd simply versified what he calls in The Ring and the Book pure crude fact, as he found it in his source material. But close examination of both poems reveals all kinds of subtle transformations, from the changing of dates to the telescoping of events to heighten their dramatic impact. In the source material, for instance, Malerio's act of self-immolation, when he thrusts his hands into the fire, occurs in the presence of one other person, a friend of his. In the poem, it occurs while his cousins are trying to bully him into breaking off his relationship with Madame de Backer. So clearly that gives an added kind of dramatic context to that incident. The sum of these changes tends, in both poems, to heighten the archetypal or symbolic significance of events, elevating them from pure crude fact into something with moral and spiritual resonance. In the passage I just discussed a second ago, the passage dealing with Miranda's fall leap from the Belvedere at the top of his house, the gardener attributes a statement to Miranda, "Angels would save him." He says that's something that Miranda said a little while before, which is not present in the source material. This statement reinforces the parallels between Malerio's leap, which Browning represents as a deluded attempt to fly to the nearby church of La Délivrante. That's actually how Browning imagines going through Malerio's mind as he leaps off the balustrade, that he's going to perform this miracle and fly to the nearby church. Okay. So there's a kind of obvious parallel between that incident and one of the temptations to which Jesus was subject during his 40 days in the wilderness. And I'll just read out this passage from Luke's Gospel, because I think it stands behind the poem as a whole in some respects, and really helps us to understand why Browning interpreted the incident in the way he did. So this is from Luke's Gospel. "And he brought him to Jerusalem," in the authorized version, which was obviously the one that Browning would have known. "And he brought him to Jerusalem and set him on a pinnacle of the temple and said unto him, If thou be the Son of God, cast thyself down from hence. For it is written, He shall give his angels charge over thee, to keep thee. And in their hands they shall bear thee up, lest at any time thou dash thy foot against a stone. And Jesus answering said unto him, It is said, Thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God." So you can see that that's a kind of really important parallel between the main action of the poem and that passage in Luke's Gospel. The fact that the unfortunate Malerio succumbs to this temptation is, for the poem, I think, an indictment not just of him, but of the entire religious system in which he was brought up by his devoutly Catholic mother. One that, according to the poem, simultaneously imposes irrational beliefs and impossible moral standards on its adherents. Another example of Browning's tendency to see the events of the case in symbolic or archetypal terms can be seen in the figure of Madame de Backer, who becomes a kind of Mary Magdalene figure, a penitent sinner. There's a remarkable passage in the second section of the poem, which I don't have time to quote in full today, when Browning becomes not just an observer, but a participant in the action of the poem, almost meeting one of his characters. So he goes to Tailleville and he sees Madame de Backer. And we don't know if he actually interacts with her. According to Sariana's letters, he did this quite a lot after the publication of the poem as well, and went to hang around Tailleville. He recalls having seen Madame de Backer during his visit to Saint-Aubin, and he describes her as frail shadow of a woman in the flesh these very eyes of mine saw yesterday, and almost apologizes to her for dragging her misdemeanors into public view in his poem, excusing himself with the thought that the case has already appeared in the newspapers. He sees it as his role not to criticize or shame her, but to make the best case he can for her. 20 years long, he says, you may have loved this man. He must have loved you. That's a happy life, whatever was your right to lead the same. He will not, he reassures her, be the one to cast the first stone at her, and that image of casting the first stone is used repeatedly in the poem as well. There are, however, contradictions in the poem's representation of Madame de Backer, or Madame Mulhausen as she's called in the poem, and these are a legacy of some of the unexpected ways in which real life obtruded itself into Browning's poem. When he switched publisher to George Smith in 1866, Browning made it a condition that Smith would not read any of the poems he submitted in manuscript and would wait until they were set in type for the poet to correct before looking at them. So obviously a poet, in the 19th century, you'd submit a manuscript, it would be set in type by the printers, and you'd then get back a proof copy, which you would work on, change, alter, correct, and then send back, usually once or twice before the thing was completed. So Smith agreed with Browning that he wouldn't look at Browning's poems until they were set up in proof. Now, when he finally got round to looking at Red Cotton Nightcap Country, he soon became alarmed by what he saw, as Robert's sister Sariana explained in a letter to Joseph Muson. So this letter again is here at the ABL, another thing that I've found over the last couple of weeks. The letters from Sariana Browning to Joseph Muson are really a very useful source of information, because she says a lot about what Browning's working on, his thoughts, his feelings about his ongoing project. So it's a really helpful thing to have access to. And she writes, now a major nuisance. Robert's poem was duly going through press when Smith, his publisher, read it and suggested that if published, Robert would be liable to an action for libel on the part of Malario Cousins. Okay? According to our English law, the truth of the statement has nothing to do with its being libelous, which I believe is still the case in our English law. Truth is not a complete defense against libel. Our lawsuits are so expensive that it would be fearful whichever way it was decided. He, i.e. Smith, consulted his lawyer, who gave his opinion it was libelous. The poem is now in the hands of Sir J. Coleridge, Attorney General, Robert's friend, who will give his opinion. So handily, Robert was friends with the Attorney General, okay, just a nice friend to have, and he asked the Attorney General to look at the poem to make sure that it wasn't libelous. And again, there's a very interesting correspondence between Browning and Sir John Coleridge about the poem, where they discuss the pros and cons of various courses of action. Of course, there's always the chance that the cousins might not hear of the poem or think it worth their while to bring an action. Still, the idea of being liable to such an action is, to me, unutterably dreadful. It's altogether very unpleasant. Robert is vexed and unwilling to lose his poem, naturally enough. Tell me if the thought ever occurred to you that the people might prosecute him. Everything is at a standstill. He is annoyed, as I said. The poem is so constructed that it's almost impossible to change the parts or cut out the selfish claimants for the fortune. Okay. So you can see this is a major crisis. Robert Browning is at this stage, according to his sister, worried that he might not be able to publish the poem, this poem that he spent a long time working on. Okay? Everything is at a standstill, she says. The publisher's saying, I'm not going to do this until I'm satisfied that it won't involve us in an action for libel. So in the weeks that followed, various options were proposed to avoid the possibility of Browning having to abandon a poem to which he'd committed several months of labour. This is the reason why there are no fewer than 6 existing proof copies of the poem, 2 of which are here at the ABL. The Attorney General proposed moving the action of the poem to another country, such as Spain or Italy, and Browning himself thought about transferring it to Brittany rather than Normandy. But in the end, he settled for the expedient of changing the names of the people and places in the poem to fictitious ones, in the hope that this would enable it to escape the attention of the litigious Malario family. Okay? And they were litigious, clearly, because they'd already spent a lot of money on 2 failed court cases. So they were quite able to spend more money on another one. Now, the final changes of name adopted in the poem can be seen in Browning's handwriting in the proof copies of the poem. Okay? They show that Browning not only changed the names of the main characters, but also tried to soften the criticism of the Malario family and to attribute this criticism to Madame de Backer rather than to the poet himself, perhaps reasoning that she would be much less likely to sue for libel than them. This can be seen particularly clearly in the last section of the poem, when Browning's Clara, which is Browning's pseudonym for Anna, confronts Malario's cousins and accuses them of selfishness, greed, and hypocrisy in their dealings with Antonio. Sir John Coleridge, the Attorney General, drew particular attention to this speech, describing it as certainly actionable. And in the proof copy in question, we can see Browning trying to draw the sting of this passage by squeezing new lines into paragraph breaks and line endings. Okay? So you can see there he's written in the gaps in the proof copy lines which, if you look at them closely, there is a clear pattern to the kind of changes he's making. So some of the comments are disclaimers, the kind of thing you would put if you didn't want to be sued for libel, like on the left-hand side there you can probably just read, "What follows you are free to disbelieve," he says. Okay? Okay. While some others, like the one on the right-hand side, attribute the opinions in this speech to Clara / Anna, the character in the poem, and not to Browning himself. So on the right-hand side there, a line has been added, "Do recollect what sort of person shrieked." Okay? What sort of person shrieked? So Browning is doing, in this bit, in these changes, kind of what he said he wouldn't do earlier in the poem, which is to cast another stone at Madame de Backer, to see her as that's what kind of person she was, that sort of woman. Okay? So the attempt to avoid a potentially costly libel action leads to a certain loss of artistic integrity in the poem's representation of one of its central characters. And the irony of this whole story is that Browning really need not have bothered. The case was sufficiently well known, even in the UK, to warrant a brief report in the Times for 15th of July 1872. So there is actually a brief summary of the case in the Times. Okay. And some of Browning's reviewers, like the reviewer in the Athenaeum, which was a very widely read periodical, recognized the case immediately as soon as they read the poem. And when they wrote their reviews of the poem, they used the real names of the characters and not the pseudonyms that Browning had so carefully elaborated in his revision of the poem. Okay. As time went by, Browning became more relaxed about the possibility of legal action and provided the Browning Society and his biographer, Mrs. Orr, with a full list of all the fictional names and places in the poem, along with their real-life counterparts. And modern editions, the Ohio Baylor edition and our edition, of course, reproduce that full list, so you can dispense to a certain extent with the pseudonyms. Okay. I'll just end today, the brief time left, by saying a few words about the second of the questions I asked at the beginning of this talk. What motivated Browning to seek out these real-life stories of crime and misfortune as the raw material for his poetry? There are, I think, a number of different strands to the answer to this question. There's undoubtedly an aspect of literary fashion at work. The 1860s saw the rise of the sensation novel, a genre of fiction dealing with criminality, adultery, and similarly taboo topics. In our edition of The Ring and the Book, we highlight some of the affinities between Browning's poem and this new and popular form. There's also little doubt that the success of The Ring and the Book itself might also have been a factor. The poem was both a commercial and a critical triumph for Browning, and he almost certainly saw in the story of Malario another opportunity to write a poem based on a true story of passion and intrigue. But Browning's interest in the poetry of real life also, I suspect, represents a response on his part to a more widespread anxiety about the status and value of fiction during the 19th century, which is itself linked to a broader concern about the status and value of culture in a materialistic and fact-obsessed age. The Victorians worried a lot about culture. What was the point of it? What was the point of all this learning? Why did we value it? Okay, and Browning, I think, like many other Victorian writers, was bothered by that and wanted to find good answers to those questions. And this anxiety about the status of fiction in particular is something that crops up in a number of Browning's other poems. But it's nicely summed up, I think, in this statement from Thomas Carlyle's essay, Biography, in which he offers the memorable assertion that fiction, while the feigner of it knows that he is feigning, partakes more than we suspect of the nature of lying, and has ever an, in some degree, unsatisfactory character. All mythologies were once philosophies, were believed. The epic poems of old time, so long as they continued epic and had any complete impressiveness, were histories and understood to be narratives of facts. Insofar as Homer employed his gods as mere ornamental fringes and had not himself, or at least did not expect his hearers to have, a belief that they were real agents in those antique doings, so far did he fail to be genuine. So far was he a partially hollow and false singer and sang to please only a portion of man's mind, not the whole thereof. Now, what Carlyle seems to be calling for here is a kind of fusion of imagination and fact, the kind of thing he attempted in his own French Revolution, which is an impassioned and poetic version of history. Browning's poem is, in fact, replete with echoes of Carlyle's French Revolution. And Red Cotton Nightcap Country, which is set at the moment of the final downfall of the Napoleonic dynasty, can in some respects be seen as a kind of poetic counterpart to Carlyle's work. Where Carlyle offers history imbued with poetry and imagination, Browning offers poetry grounded in historical fact. It is, though, significant, and perhaps under the circumstances not too surprising, that Browning more or less abandons this approach to writing poetry after Red Cotton Nightcap Country. I say more or less because a later poem, the In Album, is very loosely based on a number of disreputable episodes, but not close enough to any one of them to raise the prospect of an action for defamation. The last page of the poem, which I hope you can just see, that's the last, the kind of final closing lines of the poem, is dated January 23rd, 1873. So Browning very carefully wrote the date in, and the date was printed as part of the poem. And that's also the date on the manuscript of the poem. And the poem represents itself as the kind of working out of a single moment of inspiration. So if you look at there are some lines in the middle there, which I'll just read out. All this poor story, truth and nothing else. Accept that moment's flashing, amplified, impalpability reduced to speech, conception proved by birth, no other change. So he's presenting the poem as a moment of inspiration which he's worked out in writing this poem by January the 23rd, 1873. But, as we've seen from an examination of the poem's sources, there's no doubt that there were several changes made between the completion of the manuscript in January 1873 and the publication of the poem in early May. And some of those were quite significant changes, as we've seen. And these changes must have served as a salutary reminder to Browning that a poem based on real life has a material reality of its own and can become part of an unpredictable chain of real-world events. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Phelan, for sharing such a detailed background and helping us make those connections. I would like to turn it over to our audience if you have any questions for Dr. Phelan about red cotton nightcap country or his work here. Also, please do use the microphone when it is passed to you so that our virtual attendees will be able to hear your question and speak clearly for them. Thank you. Is there anyone who would like to get us started?
In this straight-laced Victorian period, this lurid description would offer something to the reader, but who were these readers? How many were there? Where did they come across this? And does poetic description in blank verse add anything to the news story that gave people something that they enjoyed?
Yeah, good.
It's a long poem.
It is a long poem. As I said, it's over 4,000 lines long. So Browning has certainly not given us a condensed version of this story. As far as popularity is concerned, it was not one of Browning's more popular poems. That has to be said. There was no second edition called for. Okay, he didn't revise it until he revised all of his poems for a collected works towards the very end of his life. So it wasn't a commercial hit. Okay. I mean, yes, Browning all throughout his career was a terrible judge of what was likely to be popular with the public. It has to be said, that's almost the kind of defining feature of his career. He's always misunderstanding what the public wants. In the 1850s, he thinks, oh, people like those Charles Dickens Christmas stories. So I'll write a Christmas poem called Christmas Eve and Easter Day, which was absolutely nothing like Charles Dickens' story and bombed commercially. So yes, he was very poor at judging that. As far as what it adds is concerned, I mean, that's a really good question. And I think I was trying to suggest during the talk that what Browning tries to do with these events, he kind of seizes one aspect of them, okay, or you know, he thinks he's found the key to the whole thing. And his idea of the key to this story is that Malario didn't commit suicide, you know, or if he did it in a very quixotic way by imagining that he could fly, you know, which is a bizarre kind of assumption to make. But he's picked that up from hints and suggestions in the sources, and he's linked it to this kind of continual dialogue in the poem with the very traditional piety, Catholic piety of the church at La Délivrande and the statue, the crowning of the statue. So when he's up in the Belvedere at the top of his house, he can actually see La Délivrande because he's so high up. He can see it from there. And Browning's idea is that he thinks, in this age of skepticism, I'll prove to everybody that I can carry out a miracle. You know, I can fly to the church at La Délivrande. And that's what, according to Browning's almost certainly fanciful notion of what was going on there, that's what happens, okay? So he's added that, but what that gives him the ability to do, as I suggested, is to transform Malario's story from something rather sordid and unpleasant into something that gives us some kind of moral instruction. Because what he's really saying is, you know, I don't want to you know, it is an anti-Catholic poem, okay? And one in Browning's repertoire as well. He clearly sees the Catholic Church as a church that has very serious problems, that separates moral values from ritual piety. Okay, so on the one hand, you have acts of devotion, giving costly gifts to the church, okay, and that's kind of separate from your personal moral behavior. And he thinks that that's what's one of the main things that's wrong with France. In fact, there's a really gruesome and unpleasant use of the nightcap image right at the very end of the poem, when he says, you know, it would be great, and you know, for a start, he compares the priests and the nuns who make their way to Malario's house to get their gifts to dung beetles. Okay, so that's not a very complimentary comparison. And then he says, wouldn't it be great if the Catholic Church just disintegrated, and the last use we could have for the cotton nightcap would be to pull it over the decomposing face of the Catholic Church. Yes, I'm afraid so. This is fairly gruesome stuff, I mean, in line with the general gruesomeness of the poem. But, you know, it tells you that, as I said, to come back to your original question, Browning is trying to give a kind of moral gloss, to make this something with some kind of lesson for us, political lesson, moral lesson, and even in the case of thinking about the church, you know, a religious lesson. Browning's friend, Joseph Milson, probably his best friend during his adult life, was a French Protestant, and you know, he was someone who shared kind of Browning's distinctly uneasy feelings about some aspects of Catholicism.
We will take a question from our online audience right now.
Online audience.
So Doug Tharp has a question. The red nightcap was worn by revolutionaries in France. Can you elaborate on the revolution element or the politics of the time? And then you didn't choose this because of any connection to the red ball caps in the US today, of course.
I don't even understand the second part of the question, so I'm not going to get involved in that. As far as the first part of the question is concerned, yeah, absolutely. I mean, for 20 years, between 1852 and 1870, France was ruled by Louis Napoleon III. Okay, he was an extraordinary character, a charlatan. He might not even have been Napoleon's nephew. There's some significant doubt about that. But he managed to convince the entire country that he was the legitimate heir to Napoleon Bonaparte. He was a serial liar. He was someone who interfered in foreign countries' affairs, okay? Embarked on ruinous overseas adventures, like trying to set up a kingdom in Mexico in the 1860s. So he was an extraordinary character, a kind of larger-than-life character. And in 1870, his final act of hubris was to pick a fight with Prussia, with Bismarck and the Prussian Empire. And Prussia steamrolled France in a matter of weeks. And Napoleon left the country, went to live in England in exile, in Chislehurst in Kent. And what happened in France after that was obviously what happens after the end of a political period, which is a period of chaos, disorder. And the most striking moment of that period of chaos and disorder was the establishment of this Paris Commune. Paris was besieged by the Prussians for months, and the situation became really desperate in the capital. Browning, in fact, contributed money to an appeal for the relief of the hardship in Paris and a poem called El Veriel. And in 1871, kind of law and order collapsed, and this kind of socialist-inspired, Marxist-inspired, well, probably a little bit early for Marxism, but certainly socialist-inspired commune was established, Paris Commune. And frankly, there were lots of acts of violence, bloodshed. The Archbishop of Paris was murdered. Several other high-ranking Catholic clergy were murdered. Various buildings were vandalized and destroyed. In fact, there's a connection with a character in the poem, because the doctor who treats malaria was a man called Dr. Pasquier. And Dr. Pasquier was actually killed by the communards during the Paris Commune. He went there as a representative, as an envoy of the government forces. And before he could give his message, he was just shot in an act of kind of unprovoked savagery. So all in all, it wasn't a glorious episode for France. Okay, the Paris Commune is sometimes a little bit mythologized, but if you read the details of what actually happened, it was not a great time. And during that period, some of the people in the Paris Commune revived some of the symbols and the language of the French Revolution of 1789 and its aftermath. And that was why you have reports of the Paris Commune of people wearing the bonnet rouge, the Phrygian cap of liberty, because they were consciously modeling themselves on 1789. But as far as Browning was concerned, I think what this represented was this kind of inherent and almost ineradicable instability in French society, partly because of the reasons I was suggesting earlier on to do with the whole of the church, partly to do with a kind of French skepticism, I mean, the kind of anti-religious movements, Voltaire, Rousseau, those people are mentioned in the poem too. So he sees this kind of latest episode as just yet another example of France's perennial instability and inability to manage the conflict between these competing elements, these warring impulses of, France in England during the 19th century, France functioned as a kind of byword for moral turpitude. Everything bad came from France. The French were, irredeemably kind of committed to living a dissolute life. But on the other hand, you had this kind of survival of a very unreconstructed form of Catholicism, like the one that made 50,000 people attend the crowning of a statue of the Virgin Mary. So you had these kind of competing, conflicting impulses, and I think the poem is reviving or highlighting the revival of those symbols as a way of commenting on France's political instability and inability to address its own problems. And Browning is not unique in this, incidentally. Matthew Arnold, his contemporary, writes an awful lot on French moral turpitude and says that that's what has caused the downfall of France. Okay, so it was quite a common perception in England. Just one other thing briefly. There are three of the poems Browning wrote in the early 1870s deal with France. There's Prince Hohenstiel-Schwangau, who is a very thinly disguised Napoleon III. Okay, in fact, there's virtually no disguise, it's just Napoleon III. There's a poem, one of the other poems in this volume called Fifine at the Fair, which is a Don Juan figure who provides a lengthy defense of adultery. Okay? And then we have Red Cotton Nightcap Country. So there are three poems there that are kind of almost a trilogy on the downfall of France in the aftermath of the catastrophic defeat in the Franco-Prussian War.
Thank you. We have time for one last question. We'll give it to the online audience.
Professor Phelan, Barbara Neary asks, how are you handling, as you work with this poem, the changes Browning made in the poem as he's clearly fearing litigation? Are you using his original and line noting his changes or accepting the changes? She's just curious.
Yeah, that's, again, a good question. It's kind of more to do with the minutiae of editorial policy. But our policy in the edition is to use the first edition text. Okay, so we will print the first edition text as it appeared after all these proof changes had happened, when it was finally published in early May 1873. That is what we call our copy text. So that's the one we'll use. But of course, we will also have a very substantial textual apparatus to the edition, because that's one of the things that you do with a scholarly edition. So if a reader wants to know all the different stages of the development of the poem, they will be able to reconstruct that from our textual apparatus. Okay? And we hope to present that in a reasonably user-friendly form at the foot of the page rather than at the back of the volume, because it's much easier to see if you just flick between the lines on the page and what's at the foot of the page. But yeah, I think to print the manuscript version would be, as we've seen, a kind of misrepresentation of the actual history of the poem. It would not be true to the poem's real-life existence and the kind of legal difficulties that Browning encountered. So those need to be part of our text, but at the same time, we also need to give readers, as I said, the tools they need to reconstruct the history of the poem's final appearance. Okay.
Thank you for joining us today, everyone, for Browning Day, and thank you, Dr. Phelan, for speaking today. Can we give him another round of applause, please? You're all invited to a reception downstairs in the Cox Reception Hall. Students, please remember to check in for CAE credit in the foyer, and please remember to sign before you leave. Thank you again for all being here. I hope we see you downstairs.